Hello and welcome. I'm joined by Ruchir Sharma, Head of Emerging Markets and Chief Global Strategist at Morgan Stanley. Ruchir, thank you very much for joining us. We are talking about your book, The Rise and Fall of Nations, the Rules of Change in the Post-Crisis World. Let me focus on one aspect of your book, which is factories first. And in the context of India, where we are today, in terms of the fact that our manufacturing share to GDP is slowing down or definitely not gathering steam, let me ask you a broad question first. Where do we stand?
Well, I think that on the overall investment front, we stand fine because our overall investment as a share of GDP is in the sweet spot, as I say in the book, between 25 to 35% is the sweet spot of identified for developing countries. The problem is that a lot of it is being propped up by the government. The private sector's manufacturing or the private sector's investment is still not picking up, and that's a really troubling sign. And the manufacturing, it's a very difficult global environment today because you have the fact that trade is slowing down everywhere. In fact, trade growth has collapsed. You also have the fact that the global economy is weak and manufacturing is in the doldrums in many places. Having said that, I'm a bit disappointed by the fact that our manufacturing is stuck, because look at what's happening in Vietnam, Bangladesh, even Cambodia. These countries are seeing a very significant increase in their manufacturing exports. And as we know that if you look at the economic miracle stories of China, Korea, Taiwan, they were all able to grow very rapidly on the base of their manufacturing success. So that to me is a real problem, that why are we not gaining more market share from the fact that China is sort of vacating the low-end manufacturing space. And because in China wages are going up, the currency is expensive. Here at least our currency is relatively cheap compared to China. And we still aren't gaining market share even though China is vacating that, and these other nations are gaining market share in the global scene.
And that also sort of leads to the point that you've made about our focus on Make in India as a very high-tech, high-end manufacturing as opposed to the industrial middle class as you've talked about.
Yeah, because even if you look at what sort of jobs, what sort of manufacturing creates jobs, and the kind of jobs that we want out here, the sort of mass jobs are created at low-end manmanufacturing. And that's where even education levels aren't required to be that high. Because if you look at Korea, Taiwan, many people think that, you know, like that they're smart, educated people, but when they actually started on their miracle paths in the 1960s and stuff, their education levels were pretty poor. And it's a chicken egg story as to which came first. Did their education levels increase first and help their economic growth, or their economic growth created the resources to educate the people? It's sort of a chicken egg story. But the key thing was that to employ lots of people who don't have very high skills, low-end manufacturing is the way to go.
To that extent, what you are arguing is, even if you're not saying it like that, is that Make in India should be repositioned perhaps to make sure that more people come in at the bottom end rather than sort of chase the people at the top end.
Yeah, because, you know, like it sounds sort of cool to talk about the fact that you're making high-end goods and you're doing defense and doing solar, like you're doing all that kind of stuff. But for a poor developing country, that's not that helpful, and it's a much harder hurdle to clear. Because, you know, like the investment you need in technology and in R&D and stuff, then you're competing with other nations which do a lot of that. Like China is now moving very seriously into that kind of space with lots of money behind it, because it's a much more middle-income country. So in India's case, I think we should sort of be happier to compete with Vietnam and Bangladesh rather than think that we're doing something so cool at the high end. That can be done, but it's not going to create too many jobs either.
Another interesting point that you've made is the share of research and the fact that a lot of research, actually almost 80% of cutting edge research, takes place in manufacturing. And that seems to be in some ways counterintuitive.
Yeah, that's right. But if you look at the example of Korea, Taiwan and stuff, the amount they spend on research and development, but that happens at a much later stage. But the amount they spend on research and development is quite incredible. But that's for more high-end manufacturing. And then, you know, countries which like Israel also have done that very well. And you also have countries like the United States which have done that very well over long periods of time.
A very interesting point that you've made is that manufacturing provides a ballast of stability. And I think you've used the example of Thailand very effectively. A country which has seen so many coups, so many changes at the political top, but yet the economy moves on and is obviously propelled by strong manufacturing.
Absolutely, because in Thailand's case, the share of manufacturing is twice that of India in the overall economy. So like India is close to 15, they're close to 30%, the second highest in the world. There's so many negative headlines about Thailand, about what's happening on the political front because of the troubles in Bangkok and those other areas. But I remember this going back to 97, 98. I was traveling in Thailand in the midst of the East Asian financial crisis, and Thailand was the worst hit by that. And one thing which struck me even then, as I was traveling on the eastern seaboard outside of Bangkok, was just how good the infrastructure was. That, you know, like even back in 97, 98, you had these amazing 4-lane highways and fancy factories, fancy by Indian standards, but you know, like outside there. And that's something which keeps the Thai economy humming. Otherwise, given the sort of political instability in Thailand that we have seen over the last 15 to 20 years, that economy would have completely collapsed.
Right. Speaking of political instability, I seem to note that the parts of the book that I've read, the heads of state that you meet inevitably seem to be either voted out or ejected within a year or two of your meeting them.
Not true, not with Putin. I mean, as I
except
said,
for Putin, but Rajapaksa and among others.
I mean, like exactly. But in terms of
Latin
the fact,
America,
that's the natural circle of life.
Yeah.
You know that, and especially today, because there's a big anti-establishment wave running through the world. But having said that, Putin and Erdogan are very much entrenched in power, and so I don't think that that my jinx has affected them.
Right. So the anti-establishment wave, is that something that we can connect with Brexit?
Yeah, I think, you know, Brexit is a fallout of that in a way, that although like the vote was very much about local issues, the fact that you got this anti-establishment wave running in the world today is very significant. You know, I tracked the popularity ratings of the 20 leaders in the world's largest countries. And what I find is that today their approval ratings are at an all-time low. They've been steadily declining since 2010, but they're at an all-time low. Last decade, 2 out of 3 incumbents were getting re-elected. Last year, the number dropped to 1 in 3. So that just tells you what the resentment is against the establishment, and whoever comes in the way or is seen to represent the establishment is getting steamrolled.
Right. And this is fundamentally economic. Would that be a fair point to make?
Yeah, I think it's like mostly economic. This has been the weakest economic recovery in post-war history for the world. It has to do with issues like income inequality and also, of course, immigration, which is a bit of a sensitive issue because it's, you know, some people fear that it's tearing the social fabric of their nations, and also the fact that at a time when economic growth is so slow, you sort of feel more resentment against obviously people who come in there and work possibly harder and better.
Right. So if I were to ask you to sum up very quickly, you know, so Factories First is all about investing the right amount of funds or putting the right amount of investment into factories, into manufacturing. You've also argued against overinvestment or excessive investment. If you were to look at, I mean, if you were to combine your thoughts, or rather put your thoughts together from what you've seen in Latin America, Southeast Asia, Asia, and obviously in North America, what is is there a sort of manufacturing ideal blueprint that emerges?
Not so much for manufacturing, as I said.
Or investment and leading to.
I think that like overall investment as a share of GDP, the sweet spot we found is between 25 to 35%. That's a sweet spot. Manufacturing, the higher it is, the better. I think it's as simple as that. So, you know, like all the East Asian countries, the successful ones, and South Korea's amazing success is really explained by that. It is amazing how they're able to keep reorienting themselves on the manufacturing front and how well they keep doing. So those economies have manufacturing as a share of their economy, which is in the region of 25 to 30%. So I'd say that, manufacturing, it is a very tough environment for manufacturing. I agree with that. There are some secular trends at play which may make it more difficult to sort of manufacture your way to prosperity. But there is still scope for it, particularly at the low end space when China is vacating that space.
Right. And conversely, if not doing it or not being able to ratchet up to the levels that you pointed out, the sweet spot is also something that's dangerous.
Yeah, because look at the case of Africa and Latin America. Like, you know, they're so poor at manufacturing.
Right. And they also have a commodities curse, as you pointed out.
That's right. You know, so it's very clear that if you want to grow sort of rapidly and sustain that growth rate, you got to do it with manufacturing, not with commodities. So I looked at economies which have sort of escaped the middle income trap, or they've achieved convergence with the United States to some extent. And they've mostly done it through manufacturing. And all the commodity heavy economies have stagnated relative to the United States for the last few decades.
Right. That's a not so optimistic note to end on, but nevertheless one must end. Thank you so much, Ruchir.
Thank you.
Thank you.